This spectrum represents the primary divide in academic research. On the left, we have absolute numbers and rigid formulas, the quantitative realm. On the right, flowing sound waves and complex text, representing subjective human experiences. Looking at this text highlighting the quantitative approach, we see its primary utility, efficiently measuring variables. But rigid numerical data struggles to capture the complex, shifting psychological dynamics of a human life evolving over time. Moving into the qualitative branches, we find three main methodologies used for professional development. We are locking in on narrative inquiry. Narrative inquiry operates as a formal qualitative research design, extracting systematic meaning from personal experiences. Researchers utilize the timing and sequence of life events as raw data, looking for the connections that link individual actions to subsequent outcomes. Treating human stories as rigorous psychological data has deep historical roots. We seize early execution in the psychoanalytic traditions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, initiated by figures like Sigmund Freud. This theory of narrative was later expanded by sociologists and philosophers like Michel Foucault, who mapped how personal identity and human power dynamics are articulated through the stories people tell. Hermeneutic philosophers, notably Paul Ricoeur, added the critical layer of interpretation, formalizing how we extract objective meaning from these chronological accounts. This video will decode that exact process. We will examine exactly how an inductive methodology transforms highly subjective, chaotic human stories into ordered, rigorous academic theory. When researchers approach qualitative studies, they often confuse narrative inquiry with ethnography or general case studies. This split-screen table breaks down the difference. Looking at the left column for ethnography, notice the web of connections forming around culture and group behavior. Ethnography seeks to understand how culture dictates values and behaviors of a collective group. The focus is always on the community as a whole. Now look at the right column for narrative inquiry. The visualization shifts completely to a single, deep linear timeline tracking individual experience and meaning. Here, the broad cultural rules become background noise. The researcher focuses exclusively on the deep experiences of a single person and how that specific individual makes sense of their own timeline. In this framework, the individual is the primary source of data, rather than acting as a mere representative sample of a larger culture. If your goal is to study the mechanics of the entire forest, you choose ethnography. If you need to map the exact root system of a single tree over decades, you choose narrative inquiry. This 5-node timeline illustrates the gold standard framework for structuring this research, developed by Clandinin and Connolly in 2000. At the first node, researchers must establish problem fit. They have to verify that their specific question actually requires detailed, real-life stories to answer, rather than simple metrics. Node 2 represents selection. The researcher purposefully isolates a very small number of individuals who possess the specific experiences required and are fully willing to share them. Moving to stage 3, data collection begins. This data takes the shape of stories, gathered systematically through semi-structured interviews, written documents, photographs, and participatory observation. This diagram represents the fourth stage, contextualization. The isolated narrative point expands outward into 3 concentric circles: personal, cultural, and historical. The researcher firmly places the story within these broader environments. To map causality within these circles, the researcher interrogates the data with mandatory questions. What happened? Who was involved? Where and when? And exactly what happened next? Finally, at the 5th node, the researcher conducts the deep analysis and rewrites the narrative into a cohesive document. These 5 steps act as a filtration system. They intake a chaotic, subjective life history and output an ordered chronological narrative ready for scientific dissection. This brings us to a major methodological hurdle. How exactly does a researcher objectively analyze a highly subjective story? The mechanism that drives qualitative analysis is coding, or in Persian, Kochguzari. Watching this text, you see the coding process. The researcher assigns specific qualitative symbols to pieces of text, detaching them from the raw document to capture their core essence within a hierarchical tree. This tree acts as an anchor. It forces the researcher to build a cohesive argument around these central axes, preventing them from jumping to irrelevant narrative tangents. To map how deep this coding goes, we rely on Lintfeldt's narrative theory, shown by this formula. A narrative equals the narrator's discourse plus the actor's discourse. Expanding that formula reveals the distinct layers researchers code. The full story is a combination of the narrative world and the directly quoted world. When building codes to map these worlds, researchers deploy two main directional approaches. The first is the top-down, deductive approach. This involves taking a pre-existing coding system and applying it to categorize the new text. The alternative is the bottom-up, inductive approach. Here, the researcher discards pre-existing frameworks and organically derives entirely new categories directly from the raw data. Regardless of the direction chosen, the coding must hold up to the strict standard of reliability, or PII. Qualitative analysis must be reproducible, independent of bias. Two trained analysts working separately should highlight the exact same sentences using the exact same codes. When multiple researchers extract the identical underlying structure from the text, the subjective story successfully converts into objective, peer-reviewed science. The methodology takes shape in academic literature, building toward Chapter 4 for organizational context, Chapter 5 for chronology, and finally, Chapter 6. Here, the coded data is reassembled to yield completely new insights into the human condition, not just confirm predetermined categories. This film strip visualization represents the temporal depth achieved through the narrative method. This analysis tracks the progression of an identity over time, providing the context required to understand change. This continuous sequence reveals the rich, dynamic psychological trajectory of a human life across the years. Human lives are built of stories, and narrative inquiry is the methodology that translates those experiences into systematic knowledge.